gave rise to the Methodist movement, and honor that heritage with a hymn sing this morning. Now, we're going to do it a little bit differently than most of you have probably ever done one before. So to help me out, I want you to pick songs, but I want you to give me both a title and the number so that everything will work. And since it is Father's Day, I would ask that the songs be picked by people who are fathers, or want to be fathers, or had a father. So, and I'm going to walk around because I've noticed over the last few years that people talk a lot quieter than they used to, and I want to be able to hear this morning. So, what would you like to sing today?
122, God of the Sparrow, God of the Whale.
Okay, 122. What else?
77, How Great Thou Art.
Okay. Yes. 432. Okay, you're on a roll. What else?
697, America.
Okay.
367, He Touched Me.
Anybody else?
707.
Okay, I think we've got 707. Came from over here. Last chance. Everybody wants to get done early today, I know. So, okay, give me just a moment here. Father's Day can be a little problematic for people because, in all honesty, not all of us had good father images when we were growing up, and the whole idea of God as father can be troublesome. There was a Bible study in an Arizona church several years ago. The pastor, they were studying the Lord's Prayer, and the pastor realized in conversations with the people in the group that almost all of them were from families where the fathers had been abusive, or they'd been deserted, or there were issues. And the opening phrase in the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, just kind of created tensions for several of them. So he finally said, you know, it's not the name so much as the image. What that represents about who God is, as somebody who cares, as a figure who's there, and all those things that you think about when you think about God. So use the title or the name of somebody who fits that role for you. So some of the people in the group started praying, Our Grandfather, who art in heaven. And some started using Our Mother, and some stayed with Our Father. The most unusual was a young man who started praying the Lord's Prayer by saying, Our Deputy Sheriff, who art in heaven. Because he said when he was a teenager, he was a juvenile delinquent. And it was a law enforcement officer who had shown him the care and concern, the love that he needed to get his life straightened out. And to him, that was an image of God. Whatever name, whatever title, whatever label you want to put on it, God is always with us. Number 122 celebrates many different titles and names of God. It's always hard to pick a couple verses out of this, but we'll sing the first and last verses of number 122, God of the Sparrow, God of the Whale. that grace of God touches our lives in so many ways and in so many places. We see it in the care of those around us. We see it in the sacraments. We see it in those moments that touch and change our lives. There's an old story about a fellow who lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly Catholic. And it was back in the days when the Roman Catholics were not supposed to eat meat on Fridays. But this fellow loved his barbecue. And every Friday he celebrated the weekend by going out and grilling a steak in the backyard. And the smell just went throughout the whole neighborhood. And his neighbors kept talking to him about it, but he had a right to his meat. And he just insisted on that. Finally, they couldn't take it anymore. The neighbors descended en masse and told him he was now going to convert to Catholicism. He had no choice in the matter. And he went to the classes, he learned the lessons, and the day came for him to join the church. The priest baptized him, sprinkled some water on his head and said, "You were born a Protestant, you were raised a Protestant, I now baptize you and pronounce you Catholic." You could tell that the servant really impressed the man, and the neighbors were all certain that things were going to be different. Next Friday evening, the smell of grilling steak descended over the whole neighborhood. And everyone was so upset, they gathered together and they ran to his backyard and walked in the gate. And he was standing there holding up a piece of steak, sprinkling water on it, and said, "You were born a fish, you were raised a fish, or you were born a steer, you were raised a steer, I now pronounce you fish." Whatever works. God's grace touches us. God's grace changes us. Number 367, we'll sing the first and last verses of He Touched Me. 367. If you're not familiar with the story of that day, this is the day in 1865 when the slaves in Texas were officially told that they'd been free for 2 years, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, and had never been aware of that because Texas had not had any Union soldiers there to tell them about it. So it was the day that freedom was announced to the slaves of Texas, and it became a celebration. It's recognized in many states today as an unofficial celebration of liberty, of freedom. It's also a way to remind ourselves that God has set us free from all the things that bind us, that hold us down, and so often we voluntarily give ourselves right back to them and forget that. But it's also a good day to remind ourselves of the pride we have in our nation, with all of its faults, with all of its troubles sometimes. It's still the greatest place in the world, and we celebrate that call of freedom that continues to resound and bind us together. Number 697. We'll sing verses 1 and 3 of America. 697. God has given to us, our families, our nation, our very lives in Christ Jesus. When we think of all the grace that God pours out upon us, we always want to respond with our own service, with our own love, with our own caring. But all too often, we lose that early commitment. All too often, we get sidetracked by other concerns and other cares. All too often, we lose our way. The story is told about a pastor who got very frustrated. Now, I'm sure his name wasn't Lauren or Seth. It's been a temptation in some churches I've served, I can tell you. But this pastor got frustrated with the absenteeism at worship services. And so he got a list of who had been coming and who had not been coming to church. And he made a list of the 10 worst offenders and gave it to his secretary and asked her to write a letter to all of them, encouraging them to be more faithful in their attendance at worship services. And she did, and within a few days he had a response from a prominent doctor in town who said, "I'm sorry I haven't been there for so long. I promise I'll be back next week, and here is a check to make up for all the weeks I've been gone," and there was a substantial donation enclosed. There was a P.S. at the bottom of the letter, and it said, "By the way, tell your secretary there's only one T in dirty, and there's no C in skunk." Which makes me wonder what she wrote to them. But it did get some response. We sometimes need that encouragement and reminder, and sometimes it comes from other people, sometimes it comes from the model we have in Jesus himself. Number 432, reminds us of that faithfulness of God. We'll sing the first and last verses of Jesu, Jesu. The story about a man who was married to a very suspicious woman. Every day when he came home from work, she would take his suit coat and start looking at it. And every day she'd find a hair. "You're seeing a blonde." You know, it didn't matter how much he protested that it was hers or it was the dog's or he got too close to his secretary that morning or whatever. She was just, every day she'd find some evidence on his jacket that he was seeing somebody else. So one day he decided he would show her. He stopped at a car wash on the way home. And one of those that have the nice powerful vacuum to use on your car. He took off his jacket, he vacuumed it, he vacuumed his pants, he practically undressed there in the lot just to make sure everything was as clean as possible, and he went home. Walked in the door, took his coat off, his wife grabbed it and started going over it. She turned it inside out. She did it another time. And finally she dropped the jacket in the middle of the floor and just burst into tears. Now he'd been sitting there thinking everything was wonderful. He was finally going to show her that there wasn't any reason to be suspicious, and it got this response. He said, "Honey, what's wrong?" Now you're running around with a bald woman. We can always find what we want to find. What do we see when we look at the world around us? Do we see evidences of terror, of problems? Do we see evidence of hatred and racism? Do we see all the difficulties that we're having? Or do we see God's grace reaching out? Do we see God's love expressed in the pets that surround us? They're always wanting to be petted or loved or hugged. Do we see God's goodness filling our homes and our lives? Do we see God's Spirit working among us? We celebrate today not the problems of the world. We know they exist. But we celebrate the fact that God is at work in our community, in our hearts, in our lives, reaching out to flood the world with love, with goodness. Number 77, we'll sing the first and second verses 1 and 2 of How Great Thou Art. 77.
Jesus.
road signs and billboards and all of those, because so often they have a message that they really don't mean to say. Now, Mary Ellen can tell you, I love to deliberately misunderstand them. Like, those signs you see near schools quite often. Stop for children in crosswalk. And I always find myself thinking, you can run over the adults, right? Messages get mixed up sometimes, but we were driving down a street in Colorado Springs a few months ago, and there was an old, I think it was originally a house, but it's been taken over and converted into a thrift shop. And there's a sign out front, and I'm sure that the sign has the name of the organization and some details about it. But the first time I saw it, my immediate reaction was, I hope that's not true. Because if that sign is true, we are in a horrible fix. Because there's a sign outside the thrift store in Colorado Springs, and it says, Faith Works, Wednesday and Friday, 11 to 2. I hope not. Because we're all in trouble if it is. Faith works all the time. Faith assures us of God's presence and power, God's goodness and grace, God's love sweeping through us into all the world, for we've been given a promise. A promise that's centered in Jesus Christ. A promise that's fulfilled in our lives. A promise that's lived out all the time. We will stand and sing the first and second verses of 707, the Hymn of Promise. Please be seated. I discovered this way of doing a hymn sing by accident some years ago. Happened to be a Sunday when I'd scheduled a hymn sing. I did that quite often because